I generally prefer the newer Rolex models to the older ones, but for some reason this Rolex Explorer 2 16570 with the black dial is the one I actually want to own. Quick thanks to Ken's Watches. This piece is from their stores. Check them out at kenwatches.com or at their retail locations in Hong Kong. I've handled a bunch of Rolex watches over the past few years whilst making watch videos. Of course, I like the GMT Masters, the Submariners, some of the precious metal stuff. Feels godly on the wrist. But this older Mark IV Explorer 2 just feels at home on my wrist. I think this watch is better than the newer generation's Explorer 2, at least the way it sits on the wrist. The newer Explorer 2 is really a much larger watch. It wears completely differently. I'd even call it a different watch. You can't compare these two as easily because they don't really share the same dimensions. It's much larger, it's more slab-sided and disc-like. If you were blindfolded, it would be extremely hard to tell that this watch is the successor to the 16570. A quick comparison of the dimensions will make that pretty clear. So the Explorer 16570, with the watch in hand, it's a 40mm case diameter, it's got a lug-to-lug of 47mm, thickness of 12.2 millimeters, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Very much a standard size 40mm watch. Now the 6-digit one, the newer generation, so the 226570 or the 216570, 42mm case diameter, 50 from lug to lug. Thickness is a bit more at 12.5, and the lug width on the 216570 is 21 millimeters, and the newest one, the 226570, is 22 millimeters. So quite a difference. So how it wears. On the wrist, the watches wear a mile apart from each other, and on my wrist, I much prefer the dimensions and feel of the 16570. The side profile of the case feels more layered and less slab-sided. This makes the watch sit slightly less balanced on the wrist, but it feels slimmer because the surface area touching your wrist is smaller. The 40mm case size is fantastic. It's an everyday wearer case size. It's got enough presence to feel nice, but also can do away under a sleeve. It's no dress watch, but it's also not as big as today's sports watches. So what are the shortcomings with this piece? The biggest detractor is the build quality. You compare it to watches of today's day and age, and they're simply built way better. So 6-digit Rolex references, way superior build quality in comparison. This particular one, it's the Mark IV, so it's got the best build quality of the 16570s. What does that mean? It means no drilled lug holes, so solid lugs and solid end links as well, so that they're not just bent sheet metal. But the problem is you still have that terrible stamped clasp, and there's really nothing you can do about that. The bracelet construction itself, it's not quite as good as Tudor even, and it's not really comparable to modern Rolex. But this particular version is in good condition and doesn't feel as jangly. It doesn't have that much bracelet stretch either. So that's something to look out for. Secondly, the movement, the 3185 or the 3186, I think it's a really solid movement, but it doesn't have 70 hours of power reserve like the newer watches. It's at 48. That's the noticeable difference, I guess. But the movement itself, it's robust, solid. It's been around since 1988. And quite easy to service, I think. So what are the things I like about this piece? The first thing that strikes you is the red GMT hand. Now, a lot of people say that the true GMT hand should be orange. I disagree. I see the appeal to both, and in a black watch, I think the red hand looks cooler. I like the combination more. I also like the hands being smaller and more subtle in this watch compared to the newer version. The newer one's got really thick hands and it's thickly outlined as well. Not the biggest fan of that, so I like the subtlety of this handset. I also like that it's not as ostentatious in general as a whole. The whole thing is quite a bit more subdued in comparison to the newer watches. I like that it's not recognizably Rolex. A non-watch enthusiast would really not know what this piece is. It's almost dull looking. It's kind of like comparing faded jeans to new jeans. I normally don't like vintage watches, older watches, but this, well, I guess it's neo-vintage, and it's something that I could actually see myself owning. Now let's talk price. So a few years ago, this piece was about 10 grand because of the crazy market, and absolutely not worth it, of course, because of the construction, it's an older watch. The 5-digit Rolexes really don't compare to the 6-digit ones. And back in 2017, 2018, I remember seeing these for about $4,000. That's kind of what it's worth, five and a half at the very max. It's currently sitting at around 7 for a good piece and 6 for something a little bit more polished. You don't really want to get something more polished. You want something in as good of a condition as you can get. So I still think it's overpriced and not quite where it should be. The problem is really finding one in a great condition. So if you want to do that, then it's either too hard to find or too expensive. So this remains one of the watches I actually want to own maybe in a couple of years' time. If you've got a similar story, let me know in the comments.